There is a version of you that is already dead. Not physically. Worse than that. He is walking around in your body right now, wearing your face, answering to your name, and he does not know it yet. He is dying slowly, one quiet compromise at a time, one swallowed opinion at a time, one more year spent waiting for permission that is never coming. And the terrifying part is this: nobody around you can see it happening. Not your family, not your closest friend, not even you, most days. Because this death does not look like death. It looks like a Tuesday. It looks like normal life, the kind you scroll past without noticing. It is slowly closing around you like a hand. But somewhere inside you, underneath all of that normal, there is a second person, silent, watching, furious. He has been waiting for years for you to finally stop feeding the version of yourself that is dying and start starving him instead. He does not want your comfort. He wants your obedience. Today, he gets his chance. Because in the next few minutes, I am going to hand you 10 quiet executions. 10 things you are going to remove from your life so silently that no one will even notice you have changed, until the day they realize they can no longer control you, guilt you, drain you, or predict you. And number 7 is the one that will make you close this video and sit in silence for a long time, because it is the one thing every single person watching this is guilty of right now, tonight, including me. Before we go further, I need you to do one thing for me. Subscribe. Not for me, for him. For the version of you that is still alive underneath the noise, the one who deserves a channel that will not lie to him, will not flatter him, and will not let him fall back asleep. If you have ever felt like you were built for something more than the life you are currently living, this is where that feeling gets a name, a method, and a weapon. The weapon is called Stoicism, and it was forged by men who buried their children, lost their fortunes, were enslaved, exiled, and sentenced to death by their own governments, and still walked out of those rooms stronger than the world that tried to break them. Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca, Cato, Zeno, men whose names outlived the empires that tried to silence them. Subscribe now, because what I am about to tell you cannot be unheard, and by the end of this video, you are going to want a reminder of who you decided to become tonight. Now, let's begin the quiet war. Most people think transformation is loud. They think it looks like a dramatic speech, a public declaration, a bonfire of old photographs, a caption that says "New me starting Monday." That is not transformation. That is a performance of transformation, and performances require an audience, applause, witnesses. Real transformation has no audience. It happens in a locked room inside your own skull, where no one is clapping, no one is watching, and no one will ever know unless you choose to tell them, which you will not, because the moment you tell them, you have already handed away part of what made it real. The Stoics understood this 2,000 years before psychology gave it a clinical name. They knew that the instant you announce your becoming, you hand the unfinished, fragile, still-forming version of that becoming to people who did not earn the right to touch it, question it, or slow it down with their opinions. So tonight there will be no announcements, only removals. 10 of them, executed in silence, the way a surgeon removes a tumor, not the way a general announces a war before the first shot is fired. The first thing you must quietly eliminate is your hunger to be understood. Sit with that for a second, because it cuts deeper than it sounds on the surface. Not your hunger to be liked, not your hunger to be approved of, your hunger to be understood, fully, completely, down to the last detail, by people who were never built with the capacity to hold the entire truth of who you are. You have spent years explaining yourself to people incapable of receiving the explanation. You have replayed conversations in the shower at midnight, rehearsing better arguments for why you left, why you changed, why you said no, as if the right combination of words would finally make them see you the way you see yourself. It will not happen. It has never happened. Not once. Not for anyone in the history of human relationships. And chasing it anyway is not connection. It is a slow, invisible bleed that empties you one explanation at a time. Marcus Aurelius, a man who ruled the known world, who commanded armies and buried his own children and still found time to write in a private notebook by candlelight, said something in that notebook that he never intended another human being to read. He reminded himself almost daily that it is not necessary for other people to know what you think, what you have done, or why you have done it. He was Emperor of Rome, the single most observed and judged man on the entire continent, and even he understood that being understood by everyone is not a requirement for a well-lived life. It is a trap dressed up as a need that grows the more you feed it, never the reverse. Epictetus, who began his life in chains as a slave, beaten so severely by his master that he walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life, taught something even sharper from that position of powerlessness. He said that if you wish to improve, be content to appear foolish and stupid in the eyes of the world, and stop caring so desperately about what everyone thinks they know about you, because their knowledge of you was never the point of your existence. Think about how much of your daily energy disappears into this single hunger. The text message you rewrite 4 times so no one misreads your tone. The explanation you give a stranger at a family gathering about a decision that was never theirs to evaluate. The argument you keep having in your head with someone who has already moved on and forgotten the conversation entirely, while you are still there, still building your case, still hoping that somewhere, somehow, they will finally understand. Here is the quiet exercise. The next time someone misunderstands your motives, your silence, your choice, your absence, notice the impulse rising hot in your chest to correct them, to explain, to defend, to make them see. And then, do not act on it. Let them be wrong about you. Let the wrong version of you live rent-free in their head, while the real version of you keeps building a life they will never fully see and were never invited into. You do not owe every person a translated version of your soul. Some people were only ever meant to see the surface, and that is not a tragedy. That is architecture. That is a wall you are finally, quietly, allowed to build without apology. There is a lesser-known figure from this same tradition, a teacher named Musonius Rufus, sometimes called the Roman Socrates, who was exiled twice for refusing to soften his philosophy to please men in power. He taught his students that a person who craves understanding from everyone around them will never achieve it, because understanding requires the other person to slow down, to set aside their own noise, and most people, most of the time, are simply unwilling to do that for anyone, no matter how much you explain, no matter how carefully you choose your words. Musonius taught that the only understanding worth pursuing with real effort is your own understanding of yourself, because that is the only audience that will still be listening at the end of your life when everyone else has moved on to their own noise entirely. Ask yourself honestly, tonight, how many relationships in your life have quietly become a courtroom where you are permanently on trial, endlessly presenting evidence for a verdict that will never actually be delivered? How many people have you handed the gavel to, simply because you were afraid of what it would mean to stop asking for their approval of a life that was never theirs to approve in the first place? The moment you stop needing the verdict, something strange happens. The courtroom simply disappears because you were the only one who ever believed it was real. The second thing you must quietly eliminate is your loyalty to people who have already left. This one will sting, so stay with me, because I promise you already know exactly who this is about before I finish the sentence. There are people in your life, or in your memory, who stopped choosing you a long time ago, but you never stopped choosing them. Maybe they left through a slow withdrawal, fewer calls, shorter replies, a friendship that quietly dissolved into obligation and habit rather than warmth. Maybe they never physically left at all. They simply stopped showing up emotionally while remaining seated at your table, eating your food, occupying your time while giving back almost nothing in return. And you, faithful, patient, endlessly hopeful, kept setting a place for them anyway, kept defending them to others who could see clearly what you refused to see, kept waiting for the version of them that used to exist to finally come back to the surface. They are not coming back. And your loyalty to a person who has already gone is not virtue, no matter how noble it feels while you are performing it. It is a debt you keep paying to a creditor who closed the account years ago and walked away without telling you. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius about the true architecture of friendship, insisting that once you have admitted a person into your life as a friend, you must trust them completely and hold nothing back. But before that admission, before you let them pass the gate, you must judge them with total and unflinching honesty. Most people do this exactly backwards. They judge cautiously before letting someone in, scanning for red flags, asking questions, taking their time, and then refuse to judge at all once that person is already inside the walls, no matter how much damage they cause once they are settled there. The Stoics practiced something almost surgical here, something that feels cold to modern ears, trained on the language of unconditional loyalty. They did not confuse history with obligation. A person who shared your past does not automatically deserve your future, simply because the past happened, simply because there are photographs, memories, inside jokes that no longer feel funny. Cato the Younger was famous throughout Rome for ending associations the moment they no longer aligned with his principles, regardless of how long the relationship had lasted, regardless of what people would say about him for doing it, regardless of the social cost of being seen as difficult, disloyal, or cold by people who had never earned the right to define his loyalty for him. Quietly eliminating this does not require a confrontation, a farewell text explaining your reasoning, or a dramatic conversation justifying why you are done. It requires something far simpler and, somehow, far harder. Stop initiating. Stop chasing. Stop keeping the account open in your mind, adding up all the reasons you should give them one more chance. Let the silence between you become honest instead of tense, instead of loaded with unspoken resentment on both sides. Some people are chapters, not the whole book, and closing a chapter is not betrayal of the story. It is what allows you to keep reading your own life instead of endlessly rereading theirs, hoping the ending changes if you just stay on the page a little longer. There is a particular kind of grief that never gets named properly, the grief of loving someone who is technically still present but has quietly checked out of the relationship years ago. You are not mourning a death. You are mourning a slow disappearance that nobody sent an announcement for, and because there was no funeral, no clear ending, you have kept the relationship alive on life support long after the actual person who used to occupy it has left the room entirely. Rutilius Rufus, a Roman statesman and Stoic practitioner, was unjustly exiled by corrupt political enemies despite his well-documented integrity, and rather than spend his remaining years resenting the friends who failed to defend him or chasing the loyalty of people who had proven where their priorities actually stood, he simply built a full, dignified life elsewhere, among people who valued exactly what he had to offer. He did not need the old circle to apologize. He needed only to stop setting a place for them. This is the quiet, private grief work nobody warns you about. You do not need closure from someone who already showed you, through their actions rather than their words, that they closed the door themselves. Closure is not a conversation you are owed. It is a decision you are allowed to make alone, in silence, without their permission or their participation. The third thing you must quietly eliminate is your reflex to prove your worth to the people who hurt you. There is a particular kind of exhausting ambition that has nothing to do with your actual goals, your actual dreams, the actual life you say you want. It is the hidden agenda running underneath your real ambition, the fantasy of walking into a room one day and watching the face of the person who doubted you, dismissed you, humiliated you, or discarded you, finally register what they lost. You picture the promotion, the success, the transformation, and somewhere in that picture, quietly, is always an audience of people who wronged you, watching, regretting, finally realizing how wrong they were. This fantasy feels like fuel. It feels like motivation on the hard days when nothing else gets you out of bed. It is actually a leash, and the person holding the other end of that leash is someone who has probably not thought about you in years, who may not even remember the moment you have replayed in your head 1,000 times. Epictetus taught something that dismantles this entire fantasy from the foundation up. He said that when someone insults or wrongs you, it is not the insult itself that disturbs you, but your own judgment that the insult matters, your own decision to hand it weight and permanence. He said a person is not hurt by what happens to them, but by their opinion of what happened to them, an opinion they keep renewing, year after year, long after the original event has ended for everyone except them. If you are building your entire future around eventually proving something to someone who hurt you, you have not actually left that moment behind you at all. You are still standing inside it, frozen, still handing that person the power to define the shape and the direction of your ambition, years, sometimes decades, after they stopped paying attention to you entirely. There is a story about Diogenes, the famous Cynic philosopher whose radical ideas heavily influenced later Stoic thought, who was once mocked publicly in the marketplace by a group of wealthy men for his poverty and his plain, undignified way of living. Rather than defending himself, arguing back, or quietly plotting a future revenge through eventual success and status, he simply continued eating his simple meal in the street, entirely undisturbed by their laughter, because he understood that their opinion of him required his participation to have any power at all, and he quietly, completely refused to participate. That is the model. Not indifference to growth or ambition itself, but indifference to the imagined audience you were secretly building that growth for. Quietly remove the imagined faces from your ambition tonight. Build the life for the version of you who will actually live inside it every single day, not for the ghosts who are not even watching, who never were, who exist now only in the theater of your own memory. Consider Agrippinus, a lesser-known Stoic senator who, upon hearing that the Roman Senate had condemned him to exile in his absence, reportedly continued his exercise routine without pause, remarking calmly that exile simply meant he would now take his afternoon walk somewhere else. When people expressed shock that he was not devastated by the men who had ruined his political career, he explained that he refused to give strangers who would never face him directly the power to determine the condition of his own mind. He had already stopped needing their permission to consider himself a man of worth long before the verdict was ever announced. That is what it looks like when the reflex to prove yourself to your enemies has been fully, quietly removed. Not bitterness suppressed, bitterness that never had anywhere left to grow, because the soil it needed was no longer there. Ask yourself honestly, whose face appears in your mind when you imagine finally succeeding? If the answer is someone who hurt you, someone who doubted you, someone who is not actually going to be standing in the room when the success finally arrives, you are not chasing a dream. You are still negotiating with a ghost, and ghosts, by definition, can never be satisfied, because they were never really there to begin with. The fourth thing you must quietly eliminate is the performance of being busy. Somewhere along the way, exhaustion became a badge of honor, and stillness became something you feel the need to apologize for, to justify, to explain away. You answer emails at midnight. You fill every gap in your calendar until there is no white space left anywhere. You wear your fatigue like proof that you are important, that you are working hard enough, that you deserve the rest you never actually let yourself take. But if you are honest with yourself, in the quiet moment right before you fall asleep, when the noise finally stops and there is nowhere left to hide, how much of that busyness was actually necessary, and how much of it was performance, a more elaborate and socially acceptable way of avoiding the harder, quieter question of whether you are actually moving toward anything real at all. Seneca, writing nearly 2,000 years ago in a world without phones, without notifications, without a single algorithm designed to fracture his attention, observed that people are not truly occupied even when they appear to be in constant motion, because most of that motion is simply a more elaborate, more socially rewarded way of running from themselves. He said that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it, and that life is actually long enough, more than long enough, if you know how to use it properly, instead of pouring it into motion that produces the feeling of progress without the substance of it. The Stoics distinguish sharply between motion and progress, a distinction most people alive today have completely lost. A wheel spinning furiously in mud produces enormous noise, enormous visible effort, enormous heat, and moves absolutely nowhere, and from a distance, to anyone watching, it looks exactly like hard work. Quietly eliminating this looks like asking, before you fill the next hour of your day with another task, whether this action moves you closer to the actual life you want, or whether it simply makes you feel useful and virtuous in the moment, while changing nothing structural about your circumstances. It looks like deliberately leaving white space in your calendar and resisting the immediate, almost physical urge to fill it with something to prove to yourself that you are not lazy, not falling behind, not wasting your one life. It looks like sitting in a completely silent room without a task, without a screen, without a justification for the silence, and discovering, often uncomfortably, whether you can tolerate being still with your own mind, or whether the busyness was always a sophisticated way of avoiding exactly that confrontation with yourself. We are almost a third of the way through tonight. If you have felt at least one of these land somewhere specific, somewhere private, stay with me, because the next one is where most people quietly lie to themselves every single day and never once notice they are doing it. There is an old story about a Roman farmer visited by a senator during a period of political crisis, begging him to return to the capital to lead the state through an emergency. The farmer, deep in the middle of ploughing his own field, calmly finished the row he was working on before responding to the request. It was not indifference to the crisis. It was proof that his sense of purpose had never been dependent on being seen as important, being busy, or being visibly needed by history. He returned to serve because it was necessary, not because he needed the emergency to validate an identity he had never built on urgency in the first place. When the crisis passed, he went back to his field without ceremony, without announcing his return to ordinary life, because the field had never stopped being where he actually belonged. Ask yourself, tonight, what your calendar would look like if no one was watching it, if there were no group chat to update, no manager to impress with your response time, no unspoken competition with people around you over who is more exhausted, more overwhelmed, more in demand. Strip away the audience for your busyness entirely, even for one single day, and see what actually remains. What remains is usually smaller, quieter, and far more honest than the performance you have been maintaining for years. The fifth thing you must quietly eliminate is the habit of negotiating with your own standards. You know the moment. Just this once. I will start tomorrow instead. This does not count because of the circumstances, because I am tired, because today was different. This is the internal courtroom where you are simultaneously the defendant, the lawyer for the defense, and the judge presiding over the case. and you have rigged the verdict in your own favor every single time the trial has taken place, so many times that you no longer even notice the rigging. Each of these small negotiations feels harmless in isolation, feels forgivable, feels like a reasonable exception rather than the rule. But character is not built in the large, dramatic, cinematic decisions that make for a good story. It is built, or slowly eroded down to nothing, in the thousands of tiny negotiations that nobody else will ever witness, that will never appear in any account of your life except the one written in the choices themselves. Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism, taught that well-being is achieved through consistent, small acts performed in agreement with your own nature and reason, not through occasional grand gestures separated by long stretches of quiet compromise. Cleanthes, his most devoted student, was said to have supported himself doing manual labor by night, hauling water in the darkness, so that during the day he could study philosophy without compromising his standards for the sake of convenience, refusing repeatedly, year after year, to lower the bar even when an easier, more comfortable path was readily available to him. The Stoics did not believe in a single decisive moment of transformation, the kind of moment we now package into inspirational videos and turning points. They believed in the patient accumulation of 1,000 private choices, invisible to everyone except the person making them, compounding silently until one day the character built by those choices simply exists, fully formed, as though it had always been there. The quiet elimination here is brutal in its simplicity, and that is exactly why most people avoid it. Stop negotiating. When you set a standard for yourself, whether it is waking up at a certain time, finishing a piece of work you promised yourself you would finish, keeping a commitment that only you will ever know about, treat that standard as a fact of physics rather than a suggestion, open for debate every single morning. You do not negotiate with gravity when you wake up. Hold your own word with that exact same weight, that same non-negotiable certainty, and watch how the internal courtroom eventually closes its doors permanently, simply because there is no longer a case left to argue. Chrysippus, who became the third head of the Stoic school after Zeno and Cleanthes and is credited with turning Stoicism into a fully rigorous philosophical system, was famously prolific, reportedly writing hundreds of works across his lifetime, many of them produced through sheer daily discipline, rather than sudden bursts of inspiration he waited around for. He did not negotiate with the blank page based on his mood that particular morning. He treated the standard he had set for his own output as fixed, showing up whether or not the muse arrived, whether or not the conditions felt ideal, whether or not he felt like it on a given day. It is worth noticing that almost nobody remembers a single excuse Chrysippus gave for missing a day of work, because the entire discipline of never negotiating meant there were simply no excuses left standing to remember. The uncomfortable truth underneath this entire principle is that you already know, right now, exactly where you have been negotiating with yourself this past month. You do not need a diagnostic quiz or a personality test to find it. It is the thing you thought of within the first 3 seconds of hearing this point. The standard you have quietly lowered so many times that lowering it no longer even feels like a decision. It simply feels like your personality. It is not your personality. It is a habit, and habits, unlike personality, can be quietly, deliberately unmade. The 6th thing you must quietly eliminate is your fear of disappointing people who were never actually invested in you. There is a specific kind of paralysis that comes from imagining the reaction of people who, if you examined it honestly under any real scrutiny, have contributed almost nothing meaningful to your actual life. The distant relative with a strong opinion about your career choices, who has not asked a genuine question about your life in years. The acquaintance from a decade ago who might judge your decisions if they ever found out about them. The version of a faceless crowd that exists only inside your own imagination, watching, evaluating, perpetually ready to disapprove of whatever you do next. You have built an entire jury of people inside your own head, appointed them, given them robes and a gavel, and most of them do not even know that the trial is happening, do not know your name well enough to recognize you if you passed them on the street tomorrow. Marcus Aurelius wrote something devastating in its precision and its simplicity. He said to observe how few things there actually are, which, if you removed them entirely from your life, everything would fall into a good and quiet existence. He was speaking specifically about the endless, exhausting calculations we run constantly about other people's opinions of us, most of whom, he pointed out, with something close to contempt, we do not even respect ourselves, and whose judgment we would never trust with anything that actually mattered to us in a serious situation. And yet we hand them enormous, disproportionate power over our decisions anyway, simply out of inherited habit, simply because disapproval feels dangerous at a primal level, even when the person disapproving holds absolutely no real stake in the outcome of our life. Here is the quiet test you can run tonight, and every night after this one. Before you let the fear of disappointing someone stop you from a decision that matters to you, ask a single, precise question. If this person's opinion of me changed completely tomorrow, would my actual life change in any material, measurable way? For the overwhelming majority of people you have spent years afraid of disappointing, the honest answer, once you actually sit with it, is no. Their opinion is smoke, weightless, shapeless, gone the moment the wind shifts. You have been rearranging the entire architecture of your life around the shape of smoke, and it is time to quietly, finally stop. There is a story about the philosopher Anaxagoras, an influence on early Stoic thought, who upon hearing news that his son had died, reportedly said only that he had always known he had fathered a mortal. This response has been misunderstood for centuries as coldness, but read correctly, it reveals something far more useful for the fear we are discussing here. He had already, long before the tragedy arrived, done the internal work of separating what belonged to him from what never did. The opinions of strangers about your life belong even less to you than the fate of the people you love, and yet you spend more energy managing those opinions than you spend on almost anything else you claim to care about. The people you are most afraid of disappointing tonight, if you actually made a list of their names, would very likely be a list of people who could not name 3 genuine facts about your actual daily life. That is not an insult to them. It is simply an accurate description of the size of the role they occupy in your reality. A role you have inflated far beyond its actual dimensions, out of habit, out of fear, out of a lifetime of training that told you disapproval was dangerous, long before you were old enough to question whether that training was ever true. The 7th thing you must quietly eliminate is the story you keep telling yourself about not yet. This is the one. Sit up for this one, because I promise you right now, in this exact moment, some part of you is running this story on a loop in the background, and you have gotten so used to the sound of it playing that you no longer even notice it is there. Not yet, because the timing is not quite right. Not yet, because you need to feel more ready first, more prepared, more certain. Not yet, because once this one specific thing finally changes, then, only then, you will finally begin. Not yet has quietly become the entire architecture of your identity, the load-bearing wall holding up everything else you tell yourself. And the terrifying truth underneath it is that not yet never actually resolves into now. It simply gets replaced by a brand new not yet, wearing a slightly different disguise, indefinitely, forever, until the disguises are the only thing left of a life you always meant to live, but somehow never quite got around to starting. Seneca confronted this directly, with a kind of urgency that still feels startling 2,000 years later, writing that people are always getting ready to live, but never actually living, that they postpone their real lives to some vague future date, guarding their money, their possessions, their time in every other respect with obsessive care, while spending the one truly irreplaceable resource, time itself, recklessly on delay, as though it were the one thing that could never possibly run out. He wrote that no one hands back the years once they are spent. No one returns you to yourself at some later date to try again, that life proceeds in almost total silence, giving no visible sign of its own swiftness, gliding past so quickly and so quietly that what is fastest by its very nature ends up seeming to the person living it almost completely motionless until it is nearly over. Here is what makes this the most painful one to eliminate, the reason it sits differently than the others. Admitting that you have been living inside not yet requires admitting, honestly, that the delay was never really about timing at all. It was about fear. Fear that if you actually started now, tonight, without the comfortable excuse of further preparation, you might fail completely and visibly, and then you would have no story left to hide behind. No more excuses to offer yourself or anyone else. The fantasy of the perfect future moment is a prison with excellent lighting and comfortable furniture. And you built every wall of it yourself, brick by brick, out of reasonable-sounding sentences that felt true every single time you said them. Quietly eliminating this does not mean recklessness, does not mean abandoning planning or preparation entirely. It means asking tonight, honestly, what the next 24 hours would look like if you stopped waiting for permission from some future, more convenient version of your circumstances, and then simply, quietly living those 24 hours exactly that way, without announcing to a single person that you have decided anything at all. If this has found something real in you tonight, tell me in the comments which number hit the hardest so far. I read every single one of them, and they are the reason this channel keeps making videos like this one, instead of easier, softer content that changes nothing in anyone's life. Now, let's finish this together, because the final three are where the entire philosophy quietly converges into something whole. The eighth thing you must quietly eliminate is your attachment to a version of yourself you have already outgrown. You are still, in certain rooms with certain people, performing a person who no longer actually exists. The role you played in your family before you understood yourself the way you understand yourself now. The reputation you built inside a friend group years ago that no longer fits the person standing in your shoes today. The identity everyone around you has quietly, conveniently frozen in place, because it is easier for them, because genuine change in you requires an uncomfortable recalibration in them, in how they see you, how they talk to you, what they expect from you, and most people would rather you stay predictable and small than watch you evolve into someone they have to relearn from the beginning. So you keep performing him, the old version, the smaller, quieter, more agreeable version, because it is easier in the moment than the awkward, unglamorous ongoing work of insisting on being seen as who you actually are right now. Heraclitus, whose ideas deeply shaped later Stoic thinking on change and impermanence, observed that no man ever steps into the same river twice, because it is not the same river a second time, and he himself is not the same man who stepped into it the first time. The Stoics extended this observation into something deeply practical and daily. They did not treat identity as fixed, sacred, or unchangeable, something handed to you once and carried unaltered for the rest of your life. They treated it as something under constant, active construction, refined and rebuilt daily through discipline, honest reflection, and deliberate choice. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each morning, before the day's demands began, that he was waking up to do the work of a human being, the ongoing unfinished work, not to sit motionless inside the frozen photograph of who he used to be years earlier, before the throne, before the losses, before everything that had shaped him since. The quiet elimination here happens in small, almost invisible moments of refusal. The next time you find yourself in a room that expects the old version of you the quieter one, the more agreeable one, the more anxious and accommodating one. Notice the familiar pull to shrink back into that old costume simply because it is comfortable and familiar to everyone else in the room, because it makes the interaction easier for them. And then, quietly, do not put it back on. Let the discomfort of being newly, unpredictably, honestly yourself sit in the room instead, even if it makes the air feel strange for a moment. People will adjust. They almost always do, faster than you expect. What they cannot do, what no one can do, is force you back into a version of yourself you have already, quietly, deliberately buried in your own mind. There is a quiet detail often left out of the story of Cato the Younger that belongs here. Near the end of his life, facing political defeat at the hands of Julius Caesar, he spent his final night reading a philosophical text about the nature of the soul, discussing it calmly with friends, before retiring without a single dramatic outburst, without performing grief or rage for the people around him who expected exactly that from a man in his position. He had spent decades building an identity that did not require external circumstances to validate it, and in the one moment most people would have finally abandoned that discipline, he held it more steadily than ever. The version of himself he had built over a lifetime did not need to be performed under pressure, because it had never been a performance to begin with. It was simply who he had quietly become. This is the deeper reward hiding underneath eliminating your attachment to old identities. It is not simply the freedom to change, it is the eventual arrival of a self so consistently, quietly built that it no longer requires an audience, a mirror, or even a crisis to reveal what it is actually made of. The ninth thing you must quietly eliminate is your need to win every argument you are pulled into. Notice, honestly, how much of your mental energy over the last month alone has been spent constructing the perfect comeback, the airtight argument, the single devastating point that would finally, once and for all, make someone admit that you were right. Notice how rarely winning that argument actually changed anything meaningful in your life, except your own internal peace, which it usually damaged rather than protected, leaving you replaying the exchange for hours afterward, still arguing with someone who has already moved on to something else entirely. The need to be right in every single exchange is not strength, no matter how it feels in the heat of the moment. It is a kind of hunger that can never be fully satisfied, because there is always another argument waiting somewhere, another person wrong about something on the internet, another comment demanding your correction, your energy, your time. Epictetus was remarkably direct and almost startling about this. He said that if anyone tells you a certain person has spoken ill of you, do not waste your energy making excuses about what was actually said, but instead answer that the person clearly did not know your other faults, or they would have mentioned far more than just that one. This was not self-deprecation for its own sake. It was a radical, deliberate refusal to be pulled into every single battle offered to him throughout his day. He taught his students that the true test of genuine progress in philosophy was never how skillfully you could argue your position, but how rarely you actually needed to reach for that skill at all. Marcus Aurelius went even further, reminding himself repeatedly that the best possible revenge against someone who wronged you is simply refusing to become like them, refusing to let their pettiness recruit you into a pettiness of your own that you would later be ashamed of. Quietly eliminating this looks like letting a wrong statement about you go uncorrected in a room full of people who will have forgotten it entirely by tomorrow morning. It looks like ending a tense text exchange with a simple, calm acknowledgement instead of reaching for one final, devastating point that would technically win but cost you something far more valuable. It looks like walking away from difficult conversations with your energy and your peace still fully intact rather than your ego declared victorious, and discovering slowly, over months and years, that the two things were never actually the same thing at all, No matter how convincingly, they had always felt identical in the moment. The 10th and final thing you must quietly eliminate is the illusion that time will forgive the years you spend waiting. This is where everything we have discussed tonight finally converges into a single point. Every fear of disappointing the wrong people, every unfinished argument you refuse to let go, every frozen old identity you keep performing out of habit, every "not yet" you have ever whispered to yourself in the dark. All of it survives quietly on a single hidden assumption underneath everything else, that time is patient, that there will always be a later moment more convenient than this exact one, that the window will remain open indefinitely while you slowly, carefully gather the courage to finally walk through it. Time does not actually work that way, and somewhere underneath all the noise and distraction, some part of you has always known this to be true, even on the days you manage to successfully ignore it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What may be the single most severe, most clarifying sentence in the entire body of Stoic literature that survives to this day? You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, what you say, and what you think in this exact moment." He did not write this to frighten himself into anxiety or paralysis. He wrote it deliberately to strip away the comfortable illusion of infinite time, the soothing lie that allows people to postpone their actual lives indefinitely, one convincing excuse at a time, until there is simply no time left to postpone anything further. Seneca calculated this same truth even more precisely in his own writing, observing that of all people alive, only those who genuinely devote themselves to honest reflection can actually be said to truly live, because everyone else simply exists through the passing of their days, moving through them on autopilot, arriving eventually at the very end, having never truly, fully inhabited a single one of them. There is no clean, satisfying resolution to this final point, no simple exercise that fixes it neatly in one closing sentence. There is only the fact itself, sitting quietly in front of you right now, in this exact moment, in this exact silence. The version of you that was already dying at the very beginning of this video, the one wearing your face, answering to your name, walking through your ordinary Tuesday, is still in there tonight, deciding right now whether tonight was the night something finally actually changed, or whether this was simply another video you watched before quietly returning to the same life you have always lived, unchanged, unmoved, exactly as before. Nobody else will ever know which one you chose tonight. That was always the entire point of everything the Stoics taught. The war is quiet, the elimination is quiet, and the person who walks out of this the way the Stoics intended will never announce it to a single soul. He will simply, one day, without fanfare, no longer be recognizable as the person who started watching tonight, and that quiet, private transformation will be the only proof anyone ever needs, including himself, especially himself. If even one of these 10 found its way into you tonight and settled somewhere it needed to, subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this, for the quiet ones out there doing the real work where absolutely no one is watching and no one is applauding. And if you are still here, still listening, still with me after everything we have walked through together tonight, tell me which number you are eliminating first, because someone else scrolling through these comments tomorrow morning needs to see that they are not the only one fighting this exact war in silence.